Weissner, an American of German extraction, led yet another expedition to K2. Weissner and the Sherpa Pasang Dawa established Camp 8 at 25,300 feet on July the 14th, 1939, with Dudley Wolfe in support at Camp 7. They were in striking distance of the summit. Now something went radically wrong. A young, inexperienced climber, Durrance, assuming that Weissner would be returning triumphant in a couple of days, systematically stripped the mountain of all the gear in the lower camps, including the spare sleeping bags. This extraordinary decision left the mountain completely bare.
And this is where the tragedy was to begin. They dropped down the following day to Camp 7, still expecting to find Sherpas and other climbers. And of course, then they were appalled to find that there was nothing there. The tent was evidently being left open, it was full of snow, there was no supplies, no food, but most important of all, no sleeping bags. And they'd left their sleeping bags back at the camp above them. They had a bitterly cold night, and then the next day they had to carry on down. Now, Dudley Wolfe had actually brought his sleeping bag down with him. He had a sleeping bag. And so he decided he'd just wait up there for them to come back and make yet another bid for the summit. They tried to persuade him to go down with him, but he couldn't be persuaded. And so they left Dudley Wolfe in that top camp. And then, of course, they dropped down, fully expecting to meet Sherpas at the next camp down. There weren't any. And they got all the way back down to the bottom of the mountain to base camp before they found the rest of the team. By that time, they were exhausted. They'd had it. So now you've got a situation where Dudley Wolfe is up at Camp 7 at a height of about 25,000 feet. The mountain's evacuated, and the American members of the team are really out of the story altogether. It was the Sherpas who tried to rescue Dudley Wolfe, and tragically, in trying to rescue him, 3 of the Sherpas lost their lives, and they never got Dudley Wolfe back. Anyway, now there was a gap, of course, caused by the Second World War, and it wasn't until 1953 that an expedition returned to K2. Once again, it was an American expedition led by Charlie Houston, who'd led the 1938 K2 expedition. They once again made an extremely good and detailed film of what was to be another really horrendous story.
By now, Dr. Charles Houston was the most experienced American Himalayan climber of his generation. As well as attempting K2 in 1938, he had been the first to reconnoiter after the war the southern approaches to Everest. His team, now in 1953, were to perform incredibly well. Only 26 days after leaving America, they reached K2 base camp, twice as fast as their approach in 1938. Things were going well for Houston's expedition. After only 40 days on the mountain, they were consolidating their position at Camp 8 at 25,000 feet with ample food supplies. But cruelly, the weather broke, and a series of savage storms pinned them down in their top camp. On the 6th day, tragedy struck. Charlie Houston.
We crawled out of our tents and stumbled around camp like castaways. As Art Gilty crawled out to join us, he collapsed. We rushed over to him, and he smiled feebly. "I'm all right, fellows," he said. "It's just my leg." During the night, Art had begun to cough, a dry, hacking cough. My fears were confirmed as I listened to his chest. At least 2 areas of the lung showed that clots had been carried there. He would probably not live through the descent. But we did have to give him every chance we could, and we had to do it soon. We must get him off the mountain. It was the 9th of August. We were the highest men in the world.
Once more, K2 was living up to its evil reputation. Painfully, Houston's men began the evacuation of their stricken comrade in the teeth of the continuing storm. Once more, tragedy struck in an incredible multiple fall.
I never saw a bell fall, but to my horror, I saw Strother being dragged off the slope and making desperate efforts to jam the pick of his axe into the ice and stop.
When I was whisked off the side of the mountain like a fly. I remember starting to fall and trying to arrest myself by rolling onto my ice axe and scratching it into the snow and ice, but it having no effect at all. Then after a few seconds, there was a jerk, and I stopped.
In almost the same instant, I saw Houston swept off. And though I turned and lunged at the hard ice with the point of my axe, a terrible jerk ripped me from my hold and threw me backward head first down the slope. This is it. I thought this was the end.
But for once on K2, their luck held, and the whole pyramid of climbers found themselves saved from certain death, held by Pete Schoening, who miraculously belayed his falling comrades. After this extraordinary fall and the narrowly averted disaster, Houston's exhausted team were obliged to rest. They tied Art Gilkey's stretcher to the mountain and edged their way across the slope to Camp 7, where they put up a tent for the night. 40 minutes later, they returned for the sick man, who had been shouting encouragement to them.
About 10 minutes after Gilkey's last shout, Strother, Craig, and I roped up and began to cross the slope to reach the injured man and move him somehow to the ice ledge, where we now had 2 small tents. Strother and I had had our snow glasses off most of the day because snow had frozen over the lenses, turning them almost into blinders. Apparently, we had developed a touch of snow blindness, and we seemed to be moving in a dream. Fortunately, the wind had dropped as we reached the rock rib and looked into the gully where Art had been left suspended. What we saw there, I shall never forget. The whole slope was bare of life. Art Gilkey was gone.
K2 had claimed yet another victim.
At last, in 1954, the mountain was climbed. This time it was a very strong Italian expedition. They made really good, fast progress, and 2 Italian climbers, Compagnoni and Laccadelli, actually made the summit bid. They ran out of oxygen when they were just 500 feet below the summit, but they managed to struggle on to the top. But in the struggle to get there and then getting back down, they both got very severe frostbite and actually had to be carried out. Also, tragically, another Italian was killed, Mario Puccios, a young guide. He died of high-altitude sickness, but at least K2 was now climbed.
After the multiple tragedies of Houston's 1953 expedition, the Americans resolved to mount another attempt on K2. Jim Whittaker, who had conquered Everest in 1963, launched an expedition to the Karakoram Himalayas in 1975. His was a formidable expedition, 2 years in the planning with ultra-modern equipment and supplies. This cost a staggering $100,000. His experienced team included his twin brother Lou and extraordinarily his wife Diane Roberts, intent on becoming the first woman to scale K2. The route they chose was the severe West Ridge. On the surface, everything seemed to be going according to plan, but a series of lightning strikes by the no less than 650 porters Whittaker had engaged had already threatened the expedition, and many of the tribesmen Whittaker selected had proved unsuitable for high-altitude work. Nevertheless, the situation improved once the climb got seriously underway. Camp 2 was eventually established at 20,400 feet, just 4 yards inside the Chinese border. Whittaker's expedition seemed set for a successful attempt on the summit. Then K2 struck again. The weather broke. Whittaker and his team were marooned in their tents by a series of savage storms which pinned them down for 18 days. Confined in such cramped, noisy and uncomfortable quarters, morale broke and the bored and frustrated climbers began to quarrel savagely. This was not a happy expedition. There had been bickering and resentment. Many of the climbers felt that Whittaker, his brother and his wife were interested only in reaching the summit and were treating the other climbers as beasts of burden. One of them wrote in his personal diary, "If Lou Whittaker resorts to superior physical strength, he should end up with an ice axe in the back of his head." The American dream was falling apart.
Forecast was clear in the morning.
On July the 3rd, the weather finally cleared. Conflicts and tensions forgotten, Whittaker's expedition turned their attention once more to K2. Their goal, to push the route out above Camp 2. In spite of the enforced delay, if they could open up Camp 3, the American super expedition would still have a chance. Whatever other problems there were, cameraman Steve Martz brought back from this expedition what must be the finest shots of high-altitude climbing ever filmed. But time and the weather defeated them. At 21,500 feet, the $100,000 expedition, which had begun so full of hopes, turned querulously back. Two international expeditions followed. Now, in 1978, Chris Bonington chooses the same difficult route that the unsuccessful Americans had followed 3 years previously, the formidable West Ridge. But before coming to grips with K2 itself, the grueling approach march must be completed. By comparison with the Americans, the British team with their 500 porters were having few problems. Relations with the Balti tribesmen were excellent, and the British team members were rapidly acclimatizing to the ever-increasing altitude. Doug Scott.
The Braldu Gorge does become quite a dangerous place. If there's been a heavy rain, then boulders and whole soil, mud, moraine slopes can come avalanching down. And quite often, villages have been swept away. And last year, after we'd been through, a friend of ours from Sheffield was caught in one of these avalanches. And he ended up in the Braldu River, and his body wasn't recovered.